If Machiavelli became President of the United States, a thought experiment on power, setting the frame. What this is? Before anything else, we need to be precise about what this video is and what it is not. This is not a political proposal. It is not an endorsement of any ideology system or form of leadership. It is not a critique of current events, modern governments, or contemporary figures. What you are about to hear is a thought experiment. A thought experiment is a long-standing method used in philosophy, political theory, and science. It does not exist to tell people what they should do. It exists to reveal how a system behaves when certain assumptions are introduced. When physicists imagine a world without friction, they are not advocating for such a world. They are isolating variables to understand deeper laws. This video works the same way. We are not asking whether a certain form of power is moral. We are asking how power behaves when placed inside a specific structure. The question is not, is this good? The question is, what would logically follow? That distinction matters because confusion between analysis and advocacy is where most discussions about power collapse. In everyday discourse, power is often treated as a personality trait. People speak about strong leaders, weak leaders, moral leaders, corrupt leaders. But political theory approaches power differently. Power is not primarily about character. It is about position, incentives, constraints, and perception. This is where Machiavelli enters the conversation not as a villain, not as a hero, but as an observer. He did not write to inspire virtue. He wrote to document how authority survives, collapses, or transforms under pressure. And that is why his work continues to resurface, not because societies admire cynicism, but because societies repeatedly collide with reality. Now, before going further, one more boundary must be made explicit. This analysis does not evaluate whether Machiavellian logic should be applied today. It does not argue that such logic is necessary, inevitable, or desirable. It does not suggest imitation. What it does is isolate a framework and place it inside a hypothetical environment. Why do this at all? Because modern political systems often appear confusing, contradictory, or hypocritical to the average observer. Leaders say one thing and do another. Institutions claim moral intent while producing morally ambiguous outcomes. Stability is preserved at the cost of transparency, and transparency is demanded in systems that survive by managing uncertainty. Most people respond to this confusion emotionally. They feel betrayed, angry, or disillusioned. But emotional reactions do not explain systems. Frameworks do. Machiavelli's relevance does not come from his answers. It comes from his refusal to begin with moral assumptions. He does not ask how rulers should behave in an ideal world. He asks how rulers behave when faced with instability, fear, and competing forces. That shift from ideals to mechanisms is uncomfortable. And discomfort is often mistaken for immorality. In reality, it is methodological honesty. This video adopts that same posture. We will not praise. We will not condemn. We will observe. To do that, we must temporarily suspend moral judgment, not abandon it, but set it aside. Think of it as stepping outside the courtroom and into the control room. From there, we examine how authority stabilizes itself, how perception shapes compliance, how institutions protect continuity, how power avoids being cornered. This is why the scenario is framed as a hypothetical. not because it is unrealistic, but because it allows clarity without consequence. Hypotheticals remove allegiance. They reduce emotional investment. They make structure visible. And visibility is the entire point. One more clarification. This video does not exist to make viewers feel superior, enlightened, or awakened. It is not designed to provoke outrage or agreement. If anything, it aims to reduce surprise. When people say, "I can't believe power works like this," what they often mean is, "I was taught to expect something else." Education teaches ideals. History teaches patterns. This analysis belongs to the second category. As we move forward, the language will remain deliberately neutral. You will hear phrases like, "in this model," "under this logic," "within this framework." Those qualifiers matter. They signal that we are inside a conceptual space, not issuing instructions to the real world. In the next section, we will break down the core logic of Machiavellian power itself, stripped of caricature, stripped of moral panic, reduced to its operating principles. Not to admire it, not to adopt it, but to understand what it reveals about how power tends to behave regardless of who holds it. Because understanding power does not require agreement. It requires distance. And distance is where analysis begins. Machiavelli's core logic of power. To understand how Machiavellian logic operates, we must first remove a persistent misconception. Machiavelli is often treated as a moral provocateur, someone who encouraged cruelty, manipulation, or deception for their own sake. That interpretation misses the core of his work. He was not interested in evil. He was interested in survival. More precisely, he was interested in how political systems survive under pressure, not in theory, but in practice. His analysis begins from a premise that many moral frameworks avoid power does not operate in a vacuum. It operates inside environments shaped by fear, scarcity, ambition, uncertainty, and competing interests. Within those environments, intentions are less important than outcomes. This is the first pillar of Machiavellian logic. Power is not defined by what a leader believes, but by what a system produces after decisions are made. A ruler may intend to be virtuous, but if virtue produces instability, rebellion, or collapse, the system does not reward that intention. Machiavelli observed that political authority is judged retrospectively. Success is measured after consequences unfold, not at the moment of decision. This leads to the second pillar: stability over virtue. In Machiavelli's framework, stability is not a moral preference. It is a structural requirement. A state that collapses cannot sustain laws, ethics, or ideals. Order precedes morality, not the other way around. This does not mean morality is irrelevant. It means morality is constrained by survival. Where modern discourse often asks whether an action is right or wrong, Machiavelli asks a prior question. Does this action preserve the state's coherence? If it does not, all subsequent ethical debates become meaningless because the structure required to enforce them disappears. The third pillar follows naturally: control of perception over control of force. Contrary to popular belief, Machiavelli did not advocate constant violence or oppression. In fact, he repeatedly warned against excessive force. Force is expensive. Force creates resentment. Force invites resistance. Perception, on the other hand, shapes behavior quietly. People comply not only because they are afraid, but because they believe compliance is normal, expected, or inevitable. Machiavelli understood that authority is rarely maintained by punishment alone. It is maintained by expectation. When people anticipate consequences before acting, power has already done its work. This is why symbolism, reputation, and timing occupy such a central role in his thinking. A single decisive act performed at the right moment can prevent 1,000 future conflicts. Conversely, constant explanation weakens authority by inviting negotiation where none should exist. This leads to the fourth pillar position over effort. Machiavelli was not impressed by personal struggle, moral effort, or individual sacrifice unless they translated into positional advantage. In his view, power flows through structures, not through intentions. Two individuals may possess equal intelligence, courage, or virtue, but the one who occupies a strategic position shapes outcomes while the other reacts to them. This is not cynicism, it is structural realism. Machiavelli repeatedly emphasizes that individuals do not act freely in political systems. They act within constraints imposed by institutions, expectations, and power distributions. To misunderstand position is to misunderstand power entirely. Another often overlooked element of Machiavellian logic is adaptability. He did not believe that any single strategy worked forever. What preserves authority in one context may destroy it in another. Rigid virtue is as dangerous as rigid cruelty. Effective power in his framework is situational. It responds to circumstances rather than clinging to identity. This is why Machiavelli is frequently misread as inconsistent. In reality, he was consistent in one thing only: outcomes matter more than labels. Finally, we arrive at the most uncomfortable aspect of his logic. Power is judged by its effects, not by its explanations. Machiavelli shows little interest in justification after the fact. He assumes that explanations are tools, not truths. People accept narratives that align with their lived experience. They reject narratives that contradict outcomes. A system that functions does not need constant defense. A system that fails cannot be rescued by rhetoric. This is not a celebration of deception. It is an observation about human psychology. People do not experience power as philosophy. They experience it as order, predictability, and continuity. When those elements exist, legitimacy follows. When they disappear, no moral argument can compensate. Taken together, these pillars form a coherent logic. Stability precedes virtue. Perception outweighs force, position, shapes outcomes. Adaptability sustains authority, consequences define legitimacy. This logic does not ask whether power is good. It asks whether power holds. And this is precisely why Machiavelli remains relevant. Not because societies want to become ruthless, but because societies repeatedly discover that ideals alone do not govern outcomes. In the next part, we will take this logic without praise or condemnation and place it inside a purely hypothetical structure, the modern U.S. presidency. Not to predict behavior, not to suggest imitation, but to observe what happens when an old framework encounters a contemporary system. Because when frameworks travel across time, they reveal not answers, but tensions. And tensions are where understanding deepens. Applying the logic to the U.S. presidency hypothetical. To apply Machiavellian logic to a modern presidency, we must first remove a common misunderstanding. This is not about imagining a person in office. It is about placing a framework inside a structure. In this model, the presidency is not a personality. It is a junction, a point where institutions' incentives, public perception, and systemic inertia converge. The individual matters less than the position. From a Machiavellian perspective, the first thing such a position reveals is constraint. The presidency does not operate freely. It is surrounded by bureaucracy, law, expectation, media attention, and historical precedent. Power here is not absolute. It is negotiated continuously, often invisibly. A Machiavellian framework would not interpret these constraints as obstacles to overcome through confrontation. It would treat them as terrain to be navigated. The priority, according to this logic, would not be immediate transformation, but stabilization of leverage. Before any large movement, the system must stop shaking. In practical terms, this means distinguishing between symbolic action and structural action. Symbolic actions shape perception. Structural actions shape continuity. A Machiavellian approach would privilege the second while using the first sparingly. Not every conflict needs resolution. Some conflicts, when managed, produce balance. This is where a crucial shift occurs. Rather than attempting to eliminate opposition, the framework assumes opposition is inevitable. The task is not to destroy competing forces, but to prevent them from aligning. Fragmented opposition is manageable. Unified opposition is dangerous. In this hypothetical model, the presidency becomes a regulator of tension rather than a crusader for consensus. Consensus is fragile. Managed tension is durable. Another core implication concerns communication. Modern presidencies are expected to speak constantly to explain, reassure, justify, and respond. A Machiavellian framework would treat over-communication as a liability. Excessive explanation invites interpretation. Interpretation invites negotiation. Negotiation erodes authority when authority depends on clarity. Silence used deliberately shifts attention away from intent and toward outcome. When actions occur without excessive narrative systems, adjust behavior to reality rather than rhetoric. This does not mean secrecy, it means restraint. From this perspective, information flow is not about volume, but timing. What is said matters less than when it is said, and when it is withheld. Another layer of the presidency viewed through this lens is institutional inertia. Large systems resist rapid change, not because they are irrational, but because stability is their default survival mechanism. A Machiavellian framework would not attempt to fight inertia head-on. Instead, it would align with it. By allowing institutions to move at their natural pace, authority avoids becoming the focal point of resistance. Change introduced gradually appears organic. Change forced rapidly appears imposed. In this model, patience is not weakness. It is a strategic asset. We also need to consider public perception not as opinion, but as behavior. Machiavellian logic does not treat public sentiment as a moral referendum. It treats it as a behavioral environment. What matters is not what people say they believe, but how predictably they act. If daily life remains stable, uncertainty decreases. When uncertainty decreases, compliance increases without instruction. This is why the framework focuses on maintaining normalcy rather than inspiring enthusiasm. Enthusiasm fades. Normalcy endures. Another implication involves reform. In this hypothetical application, reform would not be presented as ideological correction. It would be framed as maintenance. Systems accept maintenance more readily than transformation. Repair feels safe. Reinvention feels threatening. A Machiavellian approach would therefore avoid moral language when altering structures. Moral language polarizes. Technical language neutralizes. Decisions framed as administrative necessities generate less resistance than decisions framed as moral imperatives. Finally, there is the question of visibility. Modern leadership is expected to be visible, relatable, emotionally expressive. Machiavellian logic moves in the opposite direction. Distance creates authority. Familiarity invites challenge. This does not imply coldness or detachment from reality. It implies a controlled asymmetry. The system does not need intimacy. It needs predictability. Taken together, this hypothetical application reveals something important. Machiavellian logic does not turn the presidency into a throne. It turns it into a stabilizing mechanism. The focus is not dominance. It is endurance. Not persuasion, but alignment. Not moral victory, but structural continuity. This does not make the framework superior. It makes it legible. And legibility is the purpose of this exercise. In the next section, we will confront the limits of this logic, where it fails, where it becomes dangerous, and where modern systems resist it. Because no framework explains everything, and understanding power requires seeing not only how it works, but where it breaks. Risks, limits, and contradictions. Every framework reveals something, and every framework hides something. Machiavellian logic is no exception. Up to this point, we have treated it as a lens, not a recommendation. Now it is necessary to examine where that lens distorts, narrows, or fails altogether. Because understanding power does not mean suspending criticism. It means applying it precisely. The first limitation is overstabilization. In Machiavellian logic, stability is prioritized because instability threatens the survival of the system. But systems that pursue stability too aggressively often lose adaptability. When stability becomes the primary objective, deviation is interpreted as danger rather than information. This creates a paradox. The very mechanisms designed to preserve order can gradually suppress the signals needed for renewal. Innovation slows. Dissent is no longer interpreted as feedback, but as disruption. Over time, the system becomes efficient at maintaining itself and inefficient at responding to change. This is not a moral failure. It is a structural one. The second limitation concerns perception management. Machiavellian logic treats perception as a central lever of power. This is analytically accurate. However, sustained management of perception carries a long-term cost. When perception consistently diverges from lived experience, trust erodes. At first, people adjust behavior despite discomfort. Later, they disengage. Eventually, they withdraw belief altogether. A system can survive skepticism. It struggles to survive cynicism. Cynicism is not rebellion. It is emotional exit. And emotional exit is difficult to reverse because it does not announce itself. This reveals a key contradiction. Perception management works best when it is subtle and aligned with reality. When it becomes visible as manipulation, it undermines its own effectiveness. The third limitation lies in modern complexity. Machiavellian logic emerged in a world where power moved slowly. Information was scarce, authority was localized. Modern systems are different. Information travels instantly. Narratives fragment across platforms. Control of perception is distributed, not centralized. This does not invalidate the framework, but it weakens its leverage. A strategy built for delayed feedback struggles in an environment of immediate reaction. In such conditions, silence can be interpreted not as authority, but as absence. Distance can be mistaken for indifference. The logic still functions, but less predictably. Another critical limit involves pluralism. Machiavellian logic assumes a relatively unified social body, even if fragmented by factions. Modern societies are pluralistic in a deeper sense. They contain multiple overlapping value systems that do not converge on a single notion of order. Stability in one domain may be instability in another. This complicates the idea of a single coherent system interest. When values diverge, fundamentally maintaining continuity without appearing exclusionary becomes more difficult. The framework does not fail here, but it reveals its historical boundaries. There is also the issue of moral legitimacy. Machiavelli largely treats legitimacy as a byproduct of stability and effectiveness. If a system functions, it is accepted. Modern societies complicate this equation. Legitimacy today is not only procedural, it is symbolic. It is participatory. People expect not just order, but recognition. A system that functions efficiently while appearing emotionally distant risks being perceived as alien. This does not immediately destabilize authority, but it alters the nature of compliance. Compliance shifts from engagement to obligation, from belief to tolerance. Tolerance is thinner than belief, and thinner structures fracture faster under stress. Another contradiction emerges around adaptability. Machiavellian logic emphasizes flexibility, adjusting tactics to circumstance. But large institutions adapt slowly by design. This creates a tension between strategic fluidity and bureaucratic inertia. Attempts to move too quickly expose the system. Attempts to move too slowly entrench inefficiency. There is no stable resolution here, only trade-offs. Finally, there is the risk of misinterpretation. Machiavellian logic is frequently adopted selectively. Observers borrow its emphasis on control, but ignore its warnings about excess. They replicate tactics without understanding context. This is not a flaw of the framework itself, but of its application. Any system that focuses on outcomes can be weaponized by those who reduce outcomes to personal advantage. At that point, realism collapses into opportunism, and opportunism destabilizes the very structures it seeks to exploit. Taken together, these limits matter for one reason. They remind us that Machiavellian logic is not a master key. It explains certain dynamics exceptionally well, especially under pressure. But it does not explain everything. It clarifies how power holds. It does not guarantee that power endures. Understanding these limits does not weaken the analysis. It completes it. Because a framework that cannot be questioned becomes ideology. And ideology stops explaining reality the moment reality changes. In the final section, we will step back and ask a different question, not whether this logic is right or wrong, but why examining it at all still matters. Not as instruction, but as awareness, because awareness does not command behavior, it prevents surprise, and surprise is where misunderstanding begins. Why this thought experiment matters. At this point, a natural question emerges. Why examine this framework at all? Why revisit a political logic that feels uncomfortable, morally ambiguous, and often misunderstood? The answer is not admiration, and it is not instruction. It is orientation. Most people encounter power only when it disappoints them. They expect consistency and encounter contradiction. They expect transparency and encounter silence. They expect morality and encounter calculation. This gap between expectation and reality is where confusion grows. And confusion, more than oppression, is what leaves people disoriented. Thought experiments like this one do not exist to close that gap by offering solutions. They exist to explain why the gap exists in the first place. Machiavellian logic matters because it strips power of comforting narratives. It does not ask power to be kind. It asks power to be legible. When power becomes legible, emotional reactions soften, not because outcomes improve, but because surprise diminishes. Surprise is what makes people feel deceived. Understanding removes that sensation. This is the first value of the thought experiment. It reduces personalization. When people believe power operates through individual virtue or vice, they search for heroes and villains. When they see power as structural attention shifts, the question changes from who failed us to what incentives produced this outcome. That shift is not cynical. It is stabilizing. It replaces outrage with analysis. The second value lies in separating morality from mechanics. This does not mean morality is unimportant. It means morality is not the first explanatory layer. Many frustrations arise because people attempt to evaluate systems morally before understanding how those systems function. That sequence creates endless disappointment. Mechanics first, judgment second. Machiavelli's enduring relevance comes from reversing that order. He does not tell us what to believe. He shows us what tends to happen. This does not eliminate moral responsibility. It clarifies its limits. The third value is self-protection. Understanding power frameworks does not make someone powerful, but it makes them less naive. Naivety is expensive. It causes people to expect transparency where ambiguity is structural, to expect empathy where incentives reward distance, to expect reform where continuity is prioritized. When expectations misalign with structure, emotional burnout follows. Awareness recalibrates expectation. Not to accept everything, but to anticipate outcomes more accurately. The fourth value is restraint. This analysis does not ask viewers to agree or disagree. It does not provide villains to oppose or models to emulate. Instead, it leaves space. Space to notice patterns. Space to question assumptions. Space to observe without immediately reacting. In an environment saturated with persuasion, restraint itself becomes valuable. Not every insight requires action. Some require patience. The fifth and final value is humility. Frameworks like this remind us that no political system is pure. Every system balances ideals against survival. Every system negotiates between legitimacy and continuity. Every system compromises whether it admits it or not. Recognizing this does not excuse harm, but it prevents shock. Shock is not wisdom. It is a symptom of unexamined assumptions. This is why the thought experiment deliberately avoids conclusions. There is no prescription at the end, no warning, no call to action, because the purpose was never to tell you what to think. It was to expose how a particular logic interprets power and where that interpretation clarifies reality. Understanding power does not mean agreeing with it. It means no longer being surprised by it. And when surprise fades, something else becomes possible. Distance. Distance allows observation. Observation allows discernment. Discernment allows choice, not impulsive reaction. That is the quiet function of this analysis. Not to persuade, not to provoke, but to make the invisible visible. Because power rarely announces itself. It operates through structure timing, expectation, and silence. Once those elements are seen, they cannot be unseen. And that awareness, not ideology, is where maturity begins. This concludes the thought experiment, not with answers, but with a clearer frame for asking better questions.